You'd think a crown of iron would weigh heavier than a bishop's silk glove, yet here we are. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight we slip into the hidden corridors where robed men quietly ruled men in armor, all with nothing but parchment and whispered blessings. Funny how steel bends so easily when holy oil touches it, isn't it? Behind cathedral doors echo secrets thicker than castle walls. A king's command might roar like thunder, but a bishop's nod could hush entire armies into prayer. Imagine incense swirling through candlelit halls, while outside iron helmets clash for scraps of land they already owe to the church. Why did monarchs bow to men with no swords, and what power slept inside those golden reliquaries? And Latin chants, if you're half lulled by this old dance of crowns and crosses, a gentle tap on like and subscribe might just keep my candle burning longer than the king's treasury. And if you're awake enough, whisper into the void, whose throne would you kneel, for crown or crozier? Now let the torches flicker lower. Draw your blankets closer and drift back with me to where it all began. Long before kings carved their names into banners and coins, the bishops were already gathering land one farm at a time. You find yourself wandering through the damp fields of early medieval Europe, mud squelching under leather shoes, a distant bell tolling the hour for prayers. There's no cathedral yet, just a stone chapel, its thatch roof dripping rain into clay pots below. But inside, the local bishop is busy writing letters to Rome, securing tiny parcels of land gifted by fearful lords, hoping to buy salvation with barley fields and sheep. It's easy to forget that the earliest bishops were not the gold-clad cardinals you picture in Renaissance portraits. They were scribes, clerks, and quiet political gamblers. Some wore rough linen, others tucked silver rings beneath threadbare gloves. They walked among peasants and kings alike, speaking softly, but carrying the one thing that could break or bind a monarch the keys to heaven. One curious fact often overlooked by the 6th century bishops controlled about a third of the best farmland, in some regions more than many petty kings combined. They claimed it in drips and drabs, a dying noble's orchard, here a widow's vineyard there. No armies needed, no sieges laid, just a promise of eternal prayers whispered over the land deed. Yet surviving charters hint at murkier motives. Some historians argue that what looked like pious donations were sometimes the price for secret absolutions. Did a baron's sudden gift to the church wipe away an inconvenient murder? Some scholars remain divided, lacking the letters burned by cautious monks centuries ago. As you drift deeper, you stand among stone walls rising around early bishoprics, fortified, surprisingly strong, for men who preached peace. Listen, the wind rattles the iron hinges of a new wooden gate. A scribe inside scratches ink across parchment, copying royal grants, line by line. Each line another acre, another tithe, another coin slipped from a king's purse to the church's coffer. It's not all silent prayer either. A whispered rumor passes through the village that the bishop's nephew suddenly owns 3 fine horses, though no battle was fought to claim them. A donkey brays behind the chapel, someone's gift for an unspoken favor. In this world, blessings come with a receipt. You sit with the peasants at dusk, watching smoke curl from the bishop's kitchen. Tonight, they'll eat barley stew, thin enough to taste the iron pot beneath. Meanwhile, the bishop's table glows with candlesticks, salted pork, and sweetbread offerings for the man who holds the town's souls in parchment promises. Yet for all their power, bishops knew their role: no open crowns, no thrones. That would come later. For now, they worked in shadows, planting seeds of loyalty that would sprout into royal dependence. A noble's child, once baptized, was tied to the bishop's good graces for life. A king's marriage once blessed could be undone with the same quiet words if displeasure stirred in Rome. Researchers continue to debate just how willing the early kings were to kneel to these robed landlords. Some chronicles paint them as eager converts. Others hint at forced alliances power traded for peace under heaven's watchful eye. And so, you drift along muddy lanes from village to village. Each stone church built is another pawn moved forward on a chessboard no king fully sees. Lanterns flicker in monastic libraries where monks record every gift, every tithe, every sin forgiven. The smell of vellum and lamp oil drifts through cold corridors. Outside, farmers turn soil they no longer truly own, glancing at the chapel tower as if heaven itself is counting their harvest. So the bishops stood before the crowns, quiet, patient scribes and shepherds at once. By the time kings realized they needed the blessing to sit on the throne, the church already sat inside every manor and field. The seeds were sown the roots deep. Tomorrow, we'll follow the trail of holy oil and iron swords and see how anointed kings found themselves kneeling beneath stained glass, while knights rattled their blades outside cathedral doors. Steel clinks against marble floors. Oil drips onto royal brows. You're about to stand inside that strange space where a king becomes holy yet must kneel first, shivering as scented oil dribbles down his forehead. Picture it. Dawn breaks through colored glass windows. The church hums with murmured Latin. Somewhere beyond, armored men wait with restless horses and sharpened swords, tools of power that mean little without the bishop's gentle thumb, pressing a dab of oil onto a royal crown. The ritual feels absurd, yet here you are, watching heaven and cold iron collide in one fragile ceremony. Step closer to the altar. The air tastes of beeswax and incense. A young king, perhaps only 17, lowers his head as the archbishop lifts a tiny vial carved from crystal, rumored to hold oil blessed by saints long dead. This single act promises heaven's favor and silences any rival who dares claim the crown without it. One curious fact: the holy oil was sometimes mixed with fragrant spices, cinnamon, myrrh, even crushed rose petals. A king anointed smelled more like a garden than a battlefield, and the swords waiting outside, they gleamed sharper than ever because a holy crown still needed steel to guard it. Yet surviving chronicles disagree on what came first, the oil or the oath. Did the church claim the right to bless kings, or did ambitious rulers wrap themselves in holy words to keep rebellious lords at bay? Some scholars insist the ritual sprang from ancient Roman customs. Others argue it was a clever bishop's invention, selling divine legitimacy one drop at a time. As you stand among the courtiers, you feel the tension. Knights shift on armored feet, uneasy that their swords mean nothing without a whisper from the altar. Nobles exchange glances, some loyal, others scheming. All know that a coronation is more than ceremony. It's a contract. The king kneels now, but every blade in the courtyard ensures he won't kneel forever. Near the back pew, you notice a small, bent figure, an old nun clutching a tiny reliquary. Rumor says inside it lies a saint's fingerbone carried to bless the oil. Is it real, or just bone and legend mixed like the oil itself? No one dares question it aloud. In this hall, faith and politics swirl so tightly they're impossible to separate. Then the anointing ends. The king rises, oil glistening beneath his crown's sharp rim. Trumpets blare, iron answers oil. Outside, the swordsmen cheer, pounding shields. For a moment, church and steel stand side by side. But beneath the hymns and banners, each knows who truly bends whom. The church grants the crown, the sword defends it, or breaks it. You drift away as petals scatter at the king's feet. Somewhere behind the altar, bishops gather parchments and gold coins payment for heaven's nod. This ritual, repeated across centuries, holds kingdoms together. And yet historians still debate, was it the oil that crowned the king, or the steel that kept him crowned? Step softly from this sacred hall, where oil drips, iron glints, and both rule your dreams. A locked chest, a hidden seal, a courier galloping through the night with a letter that could crown a prince or ruin a king. You stand at the threshold of secret papal letters, parchment slips that weighed more than iron swords in the Game of Thrones. Slip back to the 11th century Europe is a patchwork of restless kingdoms and fragile alliances. Yet in a candlelit study in Rome, a single quill scratches out words that will tilt entire crowns sideways. You lean over the Pope's shoulder, careful not to breathe too loud, as Latin phrases drip onto the page. Blessings, excommunications, secret orders sealed with the signet of St. Peter himself. One curious fact, not all papal letters were grand decrees. Many were slyly informal, tiny notes, slipped to bishops and cardinals, carrying hints, instructions, or veiled threats. A single phrase, "We pray for your loyalty," could send a nervous duke scrambling to switch sides before dawn. Imagine the scene when such a letter arrives. A castle guard unlocks the main gate for a dust-choked rider. He kneels, pulls a ribbon-tied scroll from his leather pouch, and bows before the king's advisor. The royal chamber flickers with firelight as nobles gather to watch wax seals crack open red for routine matters, black for matters of thrones and damnation. Yet not all secrets survive the centuries intact. Some scholars argue that entire chains of correspondence were deliberately burned by cautious popes, wary of leaving behind trails of treachery. Others say forged letters, false papal edicts, were a tool in every ambitious noble's pocket. Historians still clash over which crowned heads rose by real blessings and which by clever forgeries. You move closer, your breath frosting the air in a cold stone chamber as a letter unrolls before a trembling king. He scans its elegant Latin lips, moving in silent prayer, or perhaps silent cursing. The parchment tells him the Pope will recognize his claim if he pays tithes, grants lands, or marries off his daughter to Rome's favored ally. Sometimes the price is an oath of fealty. Sometimes it's a war. In the shadows behind the throne, a court scribe copies every word, eyes darting to the flickering candles, half hoping the ink dries before swords are drawn. A single misplaced phrase could end in poison at dinner or an ambush in a misty forest path. Power lives in these letters more than in any fortress wall. A quirky detail, often overlooked, some kings had secret compartments built into traveling chests, just for papal letters, hidden under silks and relics wrapped in oilcloth to keep the ink from smearing in rain-soaked journeys across mountain passes. You drift through the corridors of power, where these letters flowed like dark rivers under Europe's glittering crowns. Some were read aloud in great halls to force obedience from rebellious barons. Others stayed locked in reliquaries, opened only if a king's legitimacy needed shoring up or tearing down. Surviving fragments tease historians today. A broken wax seal here, a scribbled note on the back of a royal ledger there, proof of how words from Rome reshape destinies. Was it faith or cunning? Researchers continue to debate whether the pen or the sword truly ruled the medieval chessboard. Close the letter gently now. Another rider waits in the courtyard, rain's tight eyes fixed on the horizon. Somewhere, a prince paces crown, half claimed, half lost, all depending on a slip of parchment whispering secrets across kingdoms. Snow crunches under fur-lined boots. A crown lies hidden under a heavy cloak. Tonight, you stand at the edge of a courtyard where power dissolves into frost, where the threat of excommunication forces a king to kneel quite literally in the biting cold. Step back to the heart of winter. The year is 1077. Picture the Alps looming behind a lonely castle called Canossa. You see Emperor Henry IV, no longer the roaring lion of Germany, but a desperate man shivering in a hair shirt. His royal guards wait far below, useless against a pope's pen. Here swords have no power. Only absolution does. One curious fact, excommunication wasn't just spiritual. Once exiled from the church, a king's subjects could abandon him without guilt. Nobles could rebel. Lands could break away. A single decree turned a crown into scrap metal overnight. The Pope's words cut deeper than any sword ever forged. You watch as Henry kneels barefoot in snow that comes up to his ankles. For 3 days, he waits shoulders, hunched, begging forgiveness from Pope Gregory VII. Inside the fortress, the Pope sits warm by a fire, considering whether to lift the ban. Some say Gregory savored every hour. Others argue he feared Henry's wrath if he refused too long. Scholars still debate whether mercy or strategy cracked the door open at last. Imagine the hush of the crowd. Courtiers peek through arrow-slit windows, whispering prayers or curses under their breath. Somewhere nearby, a monk records the moment in neat Latin script, knowing this tale will echo through centuries. The king of the Germans, the Holy Roman Emperor, reduced to a penitent in the snow. A quirky detail, some claim Henry's courtiers quietly slipped him bread and wine through hidden back gates so he wouldn't faint in the cold. Officially, though, he fasted, humbling his pride to melt the Pope's resolve. As you drift closer, you hear the muffled exchange when the doors finally creak open. The Pope greets the king, robes heavy with embroidered crosses, gold thread catching firelight. Henry bows, low forehead to frozen ground lips, mumbling confessions of rebellion and sin. A hush falls. No sword is drawn. No army clashes on a frozen field, just 2 men bound by ritual pride and the strange weight of invisible power. When the Pope lifts his hand in blessing, Henry's crown feels heavier than ever. He has won back his soul at the price of reminding every baron in Europe that the Church holds the keys to salvation and exile too. You wander among the onlookers, feeling the echo of Canossa in every snowflake. It was more than a single winter's penance. It was a lesson excommunication was not an idle threat, but a weapon sharper than steel. Kings would kneel again in centuries to come, some in snow, others at cathedral doors, because the fear of spiritual exile outweighed the pride of crowns. And even now, historians debate how genuine Henry's humility was. Did he truly repent, or simply bow his head to buy time, biding his hour to reclaim his throne by force? Surviving chronicles leave hints, but no clear answers. As dawn breaks, Henry rides away, boot-soaked crown secured once more, yet forever tarnished by frost, and the memory of a pope who made an emperor kneel. Footprints in the snow lead you from that frozen courtyard to another castle gate, one that refused to open, no matter how royal the visitor. Tonight, you follow the empire that knelt, in the story of a monarch's stubborn penance that reshaped how thrones and altars danced together. The winter of 1077 didn't just end at Canosa's walls. Imagine Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, trudging away from his humiliating penance, his boots-soaked robes stiff with frost. He had his absolution, but his troubles were far from melted. Europe's barons watched, some in awe, some in delight, others sharpening blades at the sight of a king forced to kneel. If the Pope could humble an emperor, what hope did lesser nobles have of defying Rome? One curious fact that slips through many history books: it wasn't just Canossa. Henry tried to reach the fortress for days. He knocked at outer gates, sent messages through frozen courtyards, begged loyal bishops to speak on his behalf. Each time the heavy doors stayed shut, iron bolts slid tight. Rumor has it Gregory VII let him wait deliberately, reminding everyone that absolution could not be seized by armies or demanded by crowns. Some scholars argue that this standoff was theater as much as theology. Did the Pope truly doubt Henry's repentance? Or was this cold dance meant to show rebellious lords that Rome's power was unyielding? The chronicles bicker back and forth, conflicting accounts scribbled by monks who either adored or despised the emperor, who once dared appoint bishops without Rome's nod. Picture Henry, standing at that gate, wind whipping his cloak like a flag of defeat, breath curling into the alpine air. Behind the battlements, flickering torchlight teases warmth he cannot claim. Beneath the stone arches, courtiers and clerics whisper. Counting each hour, he kneels as another blow to imperial pride. A quirky detail survives. In a letter, a local peasant was paid a silver coin to loan the emperor a fresh cloak each dawn, his royal furs too wet and ragged to protect him from the bitter winds. For 3 nights, the king of the Romans became a beggar at the threshold of heaven's gate on earth. When the gates finally groaned open, Henry stumbled inside, feet blistered, pride battered, but resolve surprisingly intact. He knelt before Gregory VII in a small chamber thick with incense. The Pope, robed in brilliant gold and white, placed 2 fingers on Henry's bowed head, absolving blessing, binding him once more to the Church's mercy. But the cost was steep. Henry's reputation among nobles cracked. Many saw him not as a redeemed ruler, but as a pawn humbled by the Vatican's grand stagecraft. You drift along the corridor of that fortress, now stone walls echoing the murmurs of history. Outside, the wind still howls down the Alps, but within the lesson remains: kings who defy the Church may command armies, build castles, forge alliances, yet one stubborn gate can stand stronger than 1,000 armored knights, if the Pope so wills it. Some historians claim that Henry's penance at Canossa planted the seeds for future monarchs to rebel. If an emperor could be made to kneel, they reasoned, then someday another might rise and refuse entirely. And so, the empire that knelt left behind a question that would haunt Europe for centuries: who truly rules the crown or the keys? Coins slip from one purse to another, holy hands quietly draining royal coffers, one tithe at a time. Tonight, you linger beside trembling candles and echoing vaults where church taxes turned kings' treasuries into sacred piggy banks. 1 coin for heaven, 1 less for a crown's next war. Imagine a medieval monarch pacing in his stone chamber, fingers drumming on a half-empty chest. Outside, messengers bring news of rebellions, border raids, mercenaries needing gold. Yet the king's gold is already promised to monks who pray for his soul, bishops who guard his legitimacy, and a pope who expects tribute to Rome's marble halls. A curious fact: by the 12th century clergy, taxes rivaled or surpassed some royal levies. Kings often found themselves borrowing back their own coins from the very monks and bishops they just paid. a paradox of power gold, flowing out as piety, trickling back as debt with holy interest. Walk with me through these counting rooms. Tall candles flicker over parchment ledgers, where scribes dip quills in iron gall ink, tallying wheat bushels, lambs' barrels of wine every 10th sheaf from peasant fields marked for the church. Each tithe a silent reminder that the keys to heaven weren't free. Behind thick oak doors, bishops debated how much to forward to Rome and how much to keep for cathedral repairs, new relics, or the quiet comforts of their own estates. Yet not all was so righteous. Some clergy skimmed extra off the top, renting church lands for double what the tithe demanded, then blaming Rome for the shortfall. Surviving church court records show disputes where abbots accused kings of underpaying, while kings swore the bishops padded their accounts with ghost flocks and invisible vineyards. Historians still sift through these quarrels, finding scraps of truth inked between polite prayers. Picture a peasant trudging up a muddy lane with a sack of grain on his shoulder. At the church gate, he's met by a robed collector with a wax tablet and a sharp eye for excuses. The grain is weighed taxed, stored in a stone granary next to the bishop's winter meat supply. The peasant bows, low mumbling a prayer that his family's bread lasts until spring. A quirky detail: some kings, desperate for coin, tried to tax the church back, charging fees for protection or claiming a cut of tithes for royal roads and holy bridges. But papal bulls often quashed these attempts, threatening excommunication if any king dared skim too much from God's portion. Step inside a royal treasury next. Chests, bound in iron straps, lie half filled with battered silver coins. A treasurer mutters as he stacks them, counting not what's there, but what's missing money, already pledged to crusades, cathedral spires, and monks writing sermons few peasants could read. Nearby, a royal clerk drafts a letter begging Rome to reduce next year's payment, signing it with a trembling hand. Researchers continue to debate whether church taxes truly weakened crowns or simply forced monarchs to become cleverer rulers. Some argue these holy fees fueled rebellions, peasant uprisings, and centuries of tense negotiation between throne and altar. So tonight, as you drift past ledger tables and dusty coin vaults, listen for the soft jingle of gold echoes of wealth scraped from fields and villages funneled through prayerful hands until kings themselves found their coffers lighter than a bishop's cassock. Behind thick oak doors and flickering candlelight, the real chess game begins, one not played with knights on horseback, but with cardinals in red robes, whispering moves that could topple a crown before sunrise. Tonight, you slip into the secret back rooms where kings waited outside, wondering what bargain was struck inside. Picture it, a smoky council chamber in Avignon or Rome. Stone walls lined with faded tapestries, a long wooden table cluttered with sealed scrolls, silver goblets, and half-eaten bread. Around it, cardinals lean close, voices low, eyes darting to the door every time a servant creaks the floorboards. A king's fate may hang on the tilt of a ringed finger, or a nod from an aging cardinal who's seen 3 monarchs come and go. One curious fact: many cardinals were not just pious priests, but shrewd nobles from powerful families. Men who traded battlefields for backrooms coats of mail for crimson silk. Their relatives sat on thrones or commanded armies, weaving church and crown into one tight choking knot. Outside the chamber, a royal envoy waits, cloak pulled tight, trying to read the muffled arguments within. He carries bribes hidden in his satchel sacks of Florin's promises of land the whispered offer of a marriage alliance, if only the cardinals might lean favorably when the next bull is signed. Historians still argue how much these private councils shaped Europe's map. Some chronicles hint at secret deals that rewrote borders overnight. Others dismiss them as rumor, spun by bitter nobles who lost the game. Yet scribbled notes, tucked in cathedral archives, show sudden donations, strange swaps of bishoprics and baronies all flowing from these hushed meetings. A quirky detail flickers from one such record. A cardinal once accepted a single white peacock from an Italian duke, a gift so rare it was rumored to seal a deal that saved a kingdom from papal censure. No gold, no armies, just feathers gleaming under torchlight as proof of loyalty. Step closer to the table now. The air tastes of warm wine and candle smoke. A cardinal fingers a heavy ring, eyes half closed as another leans forward, parchment rustling with lists of loyal lords, rebellious vassals, and debts yet unpaid. Every name a pawn, every debt a lever to pry open a king's vault. Nearby, a scribe dips his quill recording vague minutes that will later be locked away in cathedral libraries if they survive at all. Many did not. Fires and floods, accidental or convenient, swallowed entire troves of letters that might have betrayed how cardinals steered crowns from shadows. Outside, the envoy shifts on cold marble steps, rehearsing what he'll report back to his sovereign, that the deal is struck, or the crown's knees must bend further still. Inside a final goblet is raised blessing bribe or both. The door creaks open, a signal that tonight's chess game has ended until the next pawn moves. Researchers continue to debate how willingly kings played along. Did they see cardinals as divine shepherds or cunning brokers? Some scribes claim the cardinals were puppets for Rome alone. Others hint they served only themselves, wearing holiness like a second cloak over noble ambition. So here you stand unseen, among velvet robes and iron keys, listening as secrets bind kingdoms, tighter than any sword or treaty could. The back room grows quiet, torches flicker out, and tomorrow the world beyond these doors will wake never guessing what was promised, traded, or betrayed over wine-stained parchment tonight. Iron keys rattle on monastery doors, but inside those quiet walls lies something kings crave even more than prayer's gold. Tonight you slip through stone cloisters and flickering lanterns to discover how humble monks became the bankers of desperate monarchs. Picture a monastery perched on a windswept hill. By day, it hums with chants, garden-work scribes hunched over illuminated manuscripts. But at dusk, when peasants drift home and the courtyard stills, a different hum fills the halls, coins clinking into oak chests, ledgers unrolled across wooden desks, monks murmuring over sums large enough to outfit entire armies. One curious fact: some medieval monasteries lent more silver than the royal mint could produce in a year. Kings who needed fresh coin for battles or castles often found themselves at a monk's wooden door cloak, pulled tight against the night air hat in hand, hoping the abbey vault had enough to pay mercenaries who wouldn't fight for prayers alone. You drift down a dark passage where a monk adjusts his robe, unlocking a thick iron-bound chest with a key worn smooth by decades of secret transactions. Inside, carefully counted silver pennies, gold florins stamped with foreign rulers' faces, gemstones pledged by barons as collateral when no coin would do. A quirky detail: monks sometimes disguise loans as donations, recording interest as extra prayers or special masses for the royal soul holy bookkeeping that slipped neatly around church laws forbidding usury. Some monasteries became so rich that kings quietly complained to Rome, only to be reminded that borrowing from holy men was better than angering them. Historians continue to debate whether monks lent out of duty greed or simple survival. Some abbots claimed they loaned gold to protect their lands from war. Others said it was an act of charity for rulers defending Christendom. Yet royal archives are peppered with unpaid debts, disputes, and entire estates turned over to abbeys when a crown couldn't repay its sacred banker. Step inside the scriptorium, where young novices scrape parchment, thin copying loan contracts between prayers. Their quills whisper across vellum under flickering oil lamps lines of Latin that bind kings as tightly as any iron chain. In the next chamber, an abbot debates terms with a royal envoy, more land pledged, more relics, gifted more promises of protection from a monarch who knows the sword alone won't feed his army. Meanwhile, outside monastery gates, rumors spread through villages that the monks have hidden tunnels to move their gold unseen, that their wine cellars double as vaults for royal treasures, that some abbeys keep coded ledgers in secret libraries to hide how deep the crown's debts run. You lean closer, listening to footsteps echo off cold stone floors. Footsteps of kings, dukes, and barons who all found their way here when their own coffers ran dry. Some repaid with new grants of farmland, others with pardons for past sins. A few vanished from history altogether, leaving only an entry in a dusty ledger and a lingering prayer that the debt might be forgiven in heaven, if not on earth. So tonight, rest beside these quiet cloisters. Let the echo of coins and whispered sums remind you that sometimes the greatest fortress is not a castle's stone wall, but a monk's locked chest, and the most powerful banker wears not a crown of gold, but a simple woolen cowl. One law to bind them, another to break them. Tonight you stand between parchment scrolls and royal decrees that clashed like steel on stone. This is the tug of war, where canon law met royal edicts, and no one quite knew whose rules truly ruled. Step into a cramped chamber in a drafty medieval palace. A king's scribe reads aloud a freshly inked decree. New taxes, new punishments, new privileges for loyal barons. His voice trembles when he reaches the last lines, because every lord in the hall knows that somewhere in a cathedral not far away, a bishop is drafting a papal bull that could nullify every word with a flick of a seal. A curious fact, canon law, the church's sprawling system of rules, once outnumbered secular codes by volumes. What began as collections of papal letters and council rulings grew into a dense forest of prohibitions and permissions covering everything from who could marry whom to how much bread a priest's servant might keep for himself. Outside these palace walls, royal heralds nail decrees to wooden gates. Inside cathedral libraries, monks copy pages of canon law by candlelight, each page ready to trump a king's order if Rome wished it so. No wonder rulers felt their crowns sat precariously on top of parchment piles, rather than sturdy iron thrones. Imagine a baron caught in the middle. He owes taxes to the king, yet the bishop insists the same lands are exempt by canon privilege. If he defies the king, his lands might be seized. If he crosses the church, he might wake up, excommunicated his heirs, declared illegitimate. Some peasants mock their lords in secret, better to owe your soul to heaven than your silver to the crown. Scholars still debate which wielded more force, royal law or canon decree. Some argue kings simply ignored the pope when it suited them, enforcing their word at sword point. Others point to entire wars sparked when monarchs tried to sideline Rome's rules, only to find their armies deserting, terrified of marching under excommunication's shadow. A quirky detail in some regions, local lords resolved these contradictions with bribes to both sides, paying the bishop's fees for special exemptions then slipping a pouch of coins to the royal bailiff to look the other way. Legal, double-dipping at its finest, and all blessed with solemn prayers at Sunday Mass. Picture the scene in a village square. The king's herald bellows out a new tax edict, while on the church steps a priest reads a papal indulgence proclaiming forgiveness for anyone who gives the same silver to build a new chapel. Whose coffer does the poor farmer choose? The one with visible soldiers, or the one holding his chance at heaven? In dusty archives today, historians sift through these layers of conflicting parchment. Marginal notes hint at secret deals, sudden reversals, and contradictory oaths sworn in candlelit chapels. Researchers continue to puzzle over just how many royal edicts vanished under the weight of an unexpected papal letter delivered on horseback at dawn. So drift among these tangled scrolls tonight. Imagine kings and bishops circling each other like wary wolves, both pretending to be shepherds of the same restless flock, each hoping their ink and wax seals would hold stronger than the other's crown or crozier. Confess your sins, they said, and kings did in hushed chapels and velvet-curtained alcoves, trusting that whispered secrets would dissolve into incense smoke. But tonight, you lean close enough to hear how secret confessions sometimes turned into sharp-edged tools traded behind cathedral doors like coins. Picture a medieval king, exhausted from war and betrayal, kneeling before his confessor. The candle flickers. The priest leans in, face half lit in golden glow. Words tumble out. Treason, whispered poison plotted in air hidden far from the palace walls. All forgiven so long as the penance is paid and the priest's silence stays locked behind heavy stone walls. One curious fact: royal confessors were rarely simple monks. They were often chosen for loyalty education and subtle skill at listening to what wasn't said. Many rose to become bishops or cardinals, carrying decades of royal sins tucked safely inside their skulls. Or not so safely. Step into a castle chapel, tapestries fluttering as a draft curls around cold stone pillars. A scribe outside the door pretends to nap, but he knows the routine. If the king's confession hints at disloyal vassals' rebellion or forbidden alliances, it might become useful leverage when the time is right. Some confessors scribbled coded notes, later burned or slipped to Rome if the price was high enough. A quirky detail: there are stories of confessors slipping hints of scandal into sermons. A bishop might preach vaguely about unnatural unions or hidden bastards at Sunday Mass, all while the royal court shifted uncomfortably in the front pews, wondering if the next hint might name names. Historians remain divided on how far this secret power stretched. Some claim it was myth. No priest would dare betray the seal of confession. Others point to scattered letters and strange power shifts that make you wonder if absolution always came with strings attached. You drift behind heavy curtains now. Picture a confessional carved from dark oak, the king's knees pressing into cold flagstones, the priest's hand resting lightly on a gospel. What does it cost to keep a crown safe from whispered truth? A cathedral grant, a new abbey funded on stolen gold, or simply a promise to back the church's next crusade? Sometimes, secrets spilled the other way. Kings learned the confessions of rivals, tidbits dropped by cunning clerics who wanted papal favor. A baron's affair, a countess's secret heir, a bishop's private vice, fodder for blackmail, hush money, or sudden shifts in loyalty when battles loomed on the horizon. You see it in the margins of royal chronicles: abrupt changes in alliances, marriages annulled, claims abandoned overnight. No bloody duel, no siege, just a whisper in the dark that turned a crown sideways while the world slept on. Researchers still puzzle over how many royal decisions were shaped by these hidden sins. A king might go to war not for glory, but to silence a rumor, or offer a fat cathedral grant to make sure a confessor's tongue stayed behind his teeth. So tonight, linger at the edge of that cold chapel. Hear the murmured prayers that were more dangerous than any blade, and wonder, did kings ever really confess for forgiveness, or simply to barter sin for power, using holy ears as vaults that might crack open at just the right moment? Marble arches, solemn chants, and a crown so heavy it needed a pope's blessing to stay balanced tonight. You stand at the heart of Rome, watching how the crowning of a holy Roman emperor turned dusty roads and quiet chapels into the stage for a drama that could redeem or damn a ruler's name for centuries. Picture the Via Sacra, the sacred road winding through the old city. Dust swirls as armored knights, velvet-robed courtiers, and nervous bishops inch forward in a tangled procession. Somewhere ahead, the emperor-to-be rides a sturdy horsehead, bowed as incense smoke drifts from swinging thuribles carried by solemn monks. The air tastes of sweat, candle wax, and anticipation. A curious fact, the Holy Roman Emperor wasn't truly holy until the Pope's fingers pressed oil on his brow. Without papal approval, the crown was little more than an iron hat. Some emperors tried to skip Rome altogether, only to find no king dared swear loyalty to a ruler who risked eternal damnation by ignoring St. Peter's blessing. You drift into the Lateran Palace, where popes once met trembling emperors behind heavy cedar doors. Papal scribes laid out dusty scrolls, proof of loyalty declarations of penance, promises of military support for the Church's endless tangle of feuds and holy wars. Each word weighed more than an army, for without them, no imperial coronation could proceed. Surviving records hint at secret bribes and sudden betrayals. Some scholars argue that entire papacies rose or fell on which emperor they crowned and which they refused. Others claim it was mostly theater, an ancient echo of Rome's old emperors repackaged with holy oil and Latin chants. One quirky detail, the emperor's crown, itself known as the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire, carried relics inside its rim, tiny slivers of saints' bones or threads from sacred shrouds. The idea was simple: place your head inside holiness and wear heaven like an iron halo. Inside St. Peter's Basilica, you stand among murmuring nobles as the Pope raises trembling hands to anoint the emperor's brow. Candles flicker on marble columns. Distant choirs hum ancient hymns. The emperor kneels a mortal man, wrapped in silk and chainmail, hoping this ritual will silence any rival's claim to the throne. Outside, the people gather in muddy courtyards, pressing against guards for a glimpse of the coronation parade. Children toss rose petals at the emperor's horse, while hawkers sell cheap relics, splinters of wood from the true cross, or scraps of linen touched by the Pope's sleeve. Faith trade and politics swirl together under the Roman sun. Historians continue to debate how genuine this holy theater really was. Did the Pope's blessing truly bind heaven to the emperor's cause? Or did it simply buy the Vatican a few more castles, a fresh crusade, or leverage to remind kings who held the keys to salvation's gate? As you drift through echoing basilicas, feel the hush that followed each coronation. Bells rang across Europe to announce a new emperor, God's chosen sword-bearer. Yet behind every peal lurked the quiet truth that no matter how loud the trumpets blast, the softest whisper from Rome could unmake a crown just as easily. So stand a moment longer in that holy nave, incense swirling around golden frescoes and iron crowns. Kings rise and fall, swords rust, empires crumble, but the Pope's oil lingers a thin sheen binding mortal men to immortal promises. Slip your feet into soft leather shoes and step silently through echoing corridors. Tonight, you're inside the hidden veins of medieval power, where the clergy's spy network passed secrets from palace to pulpit and back again. Picture a young friar robe hitched above muddy boots, slipping through a castle side gate just before dawn. Tucked beneath his habit, a wax-sealed letter rattles against a tiny silver cross. He'll claim he's here for charity, maybe to bless a sick noble's child, but he carries whispers meant for ears cloaked in velvet and gold. One curious fact: the Church's vast network of messengers, confessors, and traveling monks often knew more about a kingdom's secrets than its own court scribes. In a world without telegraphs or secret police friars and priests, made perfect informants welcomed in homes trusted with sins never questioned when they lingered in a noble's hall. You drift into a dim monastery, scriptorium candlelight, catching the curve of a monk's bald head as he copies scraps of news into a small ledger. A baron's son rumored to plot rebellion, a queen's secret meeting with a foreign envoy, each note inked in cramped Latin, each dispatch carefully disguised as a prayer request or saint's relic inventory. Scholars still argue how formal these networks really were. Some believe the Church ran a tight web of informers reporting directly to Rome. Others think it was looser, more a byproduct of constant travel, whispered confessions, and curious monks who couldn't help but pass on a juicy rumor when they returned to their abbey. A quirky detail buried in monastic accounts: some monasteries hosted guest brothers who stayed only a few nights before moving on. Locals never knew that behind the polite greetings and bread shared by the fire, these wanderers swapped coded news about shifting alliances, hidden plots, and which royal treasury was about to run dry. Step closer to a royal chapel at dusk. A king kneels beside his confessor, seeking forgiveness for some sin too delicate for public ears. Yet when the priest returns to his cathedral, that whispered confession might quietly surface in a papal letter, gently steering the king's next move. Who needs blackmail when absolution and threats walk hand in hand? Outside castle kitchens, friars chat with cooks and servants gathering scraps of gossip no official messenger could sniff out. A careless word about missing silver, a rumor of a noble's mistress hidden in a hunting lodge, tiny truths collected like coins in a tithe box. Some historians remain puzzled by the lack of surviving records. Did the Vatican carefully erase this paper trail? Or did the informants never write it down at all? Either way, the effect rippled through Europe's courts. One whispered secret could stop an army from marching, collapse a marriage alliance, or tilt a crown from one brow to another. Imagine drifting behind a friar on a forest path, now his pack stuffed not just with holy texts, but with letters hidden in double linings. Each step crushes leaves over secrets heavier than any pilgrim's burden. So tonight, listen for the soft rustle of wool robes in castle halls. Somewhere between prayers and penance, the Church's invisible messengers carried truths sharper than any sword secrets that made even kings sleep lightly beneath their heavy crowns. Breadcrumbs in the dirt, murmured curses in candlelit barns. Tonight, you walk muddy village lanes, where peasants grumbled at the Church's tithes, those sacred slices of harvest that made their daily bread just thin enough to sting. Imagine a winter dawn in a medieval hamlet. frost dusts thatched roofs, while a bent old man hauls a sack of grain up to the church granary. Inside, a parish clerk weighs the bundle on iron scales, jotting down each pound on a wax tablet. A tenth of every loaf, every lamb, every vineyard barrel claimed for God, guarded by men in woolen robes. One curious fact, the word tithe comes from the Old English teogotha, meaning tenth. In theory, this share funded candles, prayers, and alms for the poor. But in practice, many a peasant watched the best wheat vanish behind stone walls, while his own stew pot scraped emptier each week. You linger near the granary doors. Muffled grumbles drift from the line of villagers' complaints about how the priest's table gleams with roast goose, while theirs holds only coarse rye and onions. Some pretend to smile when the rector passes ring glinting on his finger, paid for they suspect with their own coin. Scholars still debate how deeply these murmurs ran. Some claim the tithe was widely accepted a fair trade for spiritual security and communal feasts on holy days. Others argue resentment simmered beneath every thatched roof, kindling uprisings that later fueled revolts against the church's power. A quirky detail often missed, in lean years, some peasants offered goods instead of grain eggs. A piglet, or even a few hours of unpaid labor repairing the church roof. Records survive of clergy quarreling over whether a goat counted the same as 2 baskets of oats, or whether time in the fields could replace coin. One monk's ledger notes a frustrated entry. One widow brings hens that do not lay useless for prayers or pot. Picture a village meeting under a giant oak tree. Elders whisper about which barns might hide a sack or two before the tithe collectors come knocking. Risky business church courts were swift with fines and penances for those caught dodging their holy dues. Step into a Sunday sermon next. The priest stands high in his wooden pulpit voice, rolling over bowed heads. He reminds the flock that withholding a tithe risks the soul's peace, that charity and penance are worth far more than a few sacks of grain. But in the back pew, a farmer's son rolls his eyes. He's seen the priest's new wine cask, sweet and heavy, gifted by his father's labor. Historians still sift dusty court rolls and tithe barns for signs of rebellion. They find hints of hidden ledgers, secret barn doors, even village gossip about collectors who turned a blind eye in exchange for a side of salted pork. So tonight, you drift through these cold fields and crooked lanes, listening for the crunch of footsteps on frozen earth. Tithes kept church spires tall and altars lit, but they also carved hunger lines into hands that planted the seed. A soft grumble here, a muttered jest there, echoes of quiet rebellion that shaped how crowns and crosses learned to share the same stale bread. A jeweled relic on one table, a drunken jester at the next tonight, you slip through grand stone halls where saints and sinners dined under the same vaulted roof. Here at court, holiness and scandal rubbed shoulders over silver platters and whispered plots. Picture a flickering torch casting shadows on a long oak table. The king's feast is in full swing, platters of roast venison trenchers soaked with wine, minstrels plucking lutes in the corner. But beside the goblets and greasy fingers lies something stranger, a reliquary, its gold casing cradling a splinter of bone, or a vial of dried saint's blood, a holy fragment offered up for show blessing the banquet, or perhaps warding off a guilty conscience. One curious fact, medieval nobles collected relics the way modern collectors hoard rare coins. They displayed them at feasts and councils, not just in chapels. A saint's finger bone on the high table reminded guests that every toast and jest unfolded beneath heaven's watchful eye, though not everyone cared to behave. Move down the hall, past gossiping courtiers. A jester doublet, stained with ale, slurs a joke about the queen's cousin's miraculous piety, while the bishop seated beside him pretends not to hear, or pretends too well. Historians still wonder how often these dinners served as stages for blackmail and rumor, all hidden under polite laughter and solemn prayers. Step closer to a small wooden box resting by the salt cellar. Inside, a scrap of cloth said to have wiped the brow of a long-dead martyr. Some guests bow their heads as they pass it. Others roll their eyes, more concerned with who's slipping silver into whose purse beneath the table. A quirky detail at certain royal banquets, relics even went on tour carried around the hall by monks, each guest pressing coins into a basket in exchange for a whispered blessing or a chance to touch the sacred bone. Between bites of meat and swigs of spiced wine, salvation could be purchased for a handful of silver. Outside the chamber doors, peasants stood in the snow, waiting for scraps from the royal table bones, picked clean loaves, half-eaten by lords, who debated crusades between courses. Some say the scraps fed entire villages. Others muttered that they only reminded the poor how much of heaven was locked behind velvet curtains. Researchers continue to debate how sincerely kings and courtiers revered the relics they flaunted. Some argue they were true believers, fearing damnation if they dined without a saint's whisper of approval. Others suggest these holy trinkets were just convenient shields, pious excuses draped over deals struck in drunken confidence. Drift into a corner of the hall now, where two knights argue in low voices about a land dispute. One swears on the relic before him, the other swears on his sword. Nearby, a monk tries not to notice as coins change hands under the tablecloth. Tonight, the banquet blurs, flickering candlelight relics, gleaming laughter, rising and falling like chants at Mass. For every whispered vow of faith, another jest mocks it. Saints and sinners dine side by side, both feeding a world where crowns glitter, crosses gleam, and the line between sacred and scandalous fades like candle smoke at dawn. One pope to rule them all until there were two. Tonight you drift into the chaos of the Great Schism, when Europe's faithful woke to find not one Holy Father guiding their souls, but rival popes hurling excommunications across kingdoms like curses on parchment. Picture a crowded square in Avignon, France, in the late 14th century. A town crier unrolls a scroll and proclaims that the rightful pope sits here blessed by God, anointed by the College of Cardinals. But in Rome, hundreds of miles away, another crier bellows the same words for a rival pontiff enthroned beneath St. Peter's dome. Two popes, one church, and countless kings, forced to pick sides or risk excommunication from both. One curious fact, the schism didn't begin with theology, but with politics and egos. A single disputed election spiraled into decades of rival papacies, each claiming the true keys to heaven, each hurling decrees that left monarchs guessing which blessing would stick and which might damn them twice over. Step into a royal council chamber in Paris. Candles flicker as nobles argue over which pope deserves their taxes and armies. One bishop insists loyalty to Avignon guarantees salvation. Another swears the Roman line alone holds Peter's promise. Somewhere in the corner, a clerk discreetly jots down bribes disguised as donations to keep both popes somewhat appeased, just in case the winds shift again. A quirky detail flickers through dusty accounts. Some rulers tried to dodge choosing altogether. One German prince sent polite letters to both popes, thanking them for their guidance, but declining to pay tithes until they settled their bickering. Neither pontiff appreciated the joke. Outside palace walls, ordinary peasants muttered prayers to whichever pope their local priest named from the pulpit, hoping the saint whose statue guarded their chapel wouldn't mind if they got it wrong. Confused friars debated on muddy roads, monks scribbled contradictory dates into their calendars, and Europe's spiritual map splintered like stained glass struck by a hammer. Historians still debate who benefited most from this holy tug-of-war. Some claim monarchs exploited the confusion to grab church lands or dodge papal taxes, playing one pope against the other like squabbling cousins. Others argue the schism weakened everyone, setting the stage for future reformers to poke holes in Rome's once unchallenged authority. Slip inside an abbey at dusk, where two rival envoys argue in hushed Latin by flickering lamplight. One offers fresh indulgences for loyalty to Avignon. The other promises relics and forgiveness if the monks declare for Rome. Outside, a novice eavesdrops, torn between holy obedience and the thrill of secret knowledge he'll whisper to villagers tomorrow. A soft rustle of parchment echoes as rival papal letters arrive in the same week, one blessing a royal marriage, the other threatening excommunication if that same match proceeds. A king's council scrambles to pick the lesser sin, hoping whichever pope loses the fight won't still wield heaven's wrath when the dust settles. So tonight, you drift beneath church spires that point skyward in defiance of divided men below. Bells ring in Rome and Avignon alike, each tolling claims of unity that cracked wide open the day. Two popes crowned themselves shepherd of the same wandering flock. Close your eyes and listen. Prayers rise through the schism's tangled smoke. Faith flickers like a candle guttering in cold wind, yet the faithful still kneel, hoping heaven sorts its mess long after rival popes have fallen silent under cathedral stones. Bare feet on cold flagstones, hands folded inside worn wool sleeves. Tonight you follow the quiet footsteps of friars sent to patch wounds between kings, their simple robes shielding them from swords sharper than any sermon. Picture a smoky great hall in a drafty medieval fortress. A king's council murmurs around a heavy oak table piled with goblets and maps. Outside, knights clatter in chainmail, ready to ride at dawn if talks fail. But in the center of this tension stands a single barefoot friar cloak, patched at the elbows, voice soft as the candle's flicker that lights his pleading words. One curious fact, unlike bishops draped in silk or cardinals seated in back rooms, friars roamed roads and alleys alike. Franciscans, Dominicans, these were the bridge builders, carrying letters and treaties through war zones, ducking crossbow quarrels and suspicious guards. When royal messengers risked arrest, or worse, a humble friar could pass unnoticed, blessed by both his vow of poverty and the superstition that harming him might anger heaven itself. Step into a tiny stone chapel just beyond the battlefield. Inside, a weary friar kneels beside two furious barons, their blades resting on the cold flagstones, threats still echoing in the night air. He listens to both men's curses and pleas, then offers a simple bargain, a truce sealed by a shared mass forgiveness, purchased not by gold, but by silence and time. A quirky detail lingers in dusty monastery logs. Some friars traveled with small pouches of dried herbs to trade for safe passage through bandit territory. A handful of mint or rosemary could calm a skittish horse or sweeten a sour soldier's meal long enough to earn a safe bed for the night. Historians still argue how much real power these robed peacemakers wielded. Some say they were merely messengers, pawns caught between crown and crozier, sent out to absorb a noble's rage before the swords clashed again. Others insist certain friars swayed entire treaties, their soft words turning armies around without a drop of blood spilled. Outside castle walls, villagers whispered blessings when friars passed by. After all, these barefoot men brought hope that tax collectors might vanish, and crops would not be trampled by warring knights if peace held just a little longer. Drift further down a muddy road, where a lone friar huddles under a roadside shrine parchment scroll hidden beneath his cloak. By dawn, he'll reach the next fortress slip inside its echoing chapel and kneel before another lord who must be convinced to lower his drawbridge and listen. One friar's voice might stand between an entire village and the ruin of siege. Sometimes he succeeded feasts held instead of skirmishes, daughters betrothed to seal fragile alliances. Other times, the friar's words failed, lost in the clash of steel and pride, too loud for prayers to soften. Researchers continue to sift through letters and monastic diaries, hunting hints of which fragile truces these robed wanderers held together with candle wax ink and faith alone. So tonight, step lightly with the friar as he passes under castle battlements and into dark corridors, the echo of his footsteps softer than the thunder of hooves gathering on distant fields. In his satchel, scraps of parchment, whispered hopes, the last chance that tomorrow's dawn might break with church bells, not siege horns. A priest's cassock swapped for chainmail, a blessing whispered over cold steel. Tonight you stand at the edge of a battlefield where holy men traded prayers for swords and sometimes blurred the line between altar and armor. Picture a dawn mist rolling over a muddy plain. In the distance, banners flap, one bearing a royal crest, the other a bishop's cross. Among the knights, tightening leather straps and testing blade edges, a few figures stand out: priests, their tonsured heads hidden beneath iron helms, surplices tucked beneath battered breastplates. To a peasant's eyes, they might seem like ordinary warriors until you see the rosary beads dangling beside a dagger's hilt. One curious fact: while the church often preached peace, some clergy didn't just bless armies, they joined them. Chroniclers, record bishops riding at the head of cavalry charges, abbots rallying local militias, and parish priests defending village walls when no lord's men-at-arms arrived in time. You drift among the campfires that night before battle. A young chaplain prays over a circle of armored men, then checks the edge of his own short sword. He claims he'll wield it only if heaven wills, but everyone knows heaven often stays silent when arrows fly. Step closer to a battered wooden chest near the camp's makeshift altar. Inside lie relics, tiny splinters of saints' bones, strips of blessed cloth tied to lances or tucked into helmet linings. The belief that a holy scrap might turn a blade or guide an arrow away from a priestly heart. Historians still debate if these relics offered more comfort than protection. After all, crossbows didn't care if your soul was pledged to Rome. A quirky detail flickers in the scrolls of one chronicler. A bishop once rode to war, wearing a suit of armor, etched with psalms, each plate engraved with verses to ward off wounds. It didn't work. He was struck down by a stray lance. Yet his legend lived on, retold by monks who swore he rose to heaven fully armored. Inside the field tent, a priest-turned-commander pores over a rough map drawn on lambskin. He sends a boy to fetch the standard-bearer. His plan must reach the king's ear by dawn. In his pack sits a missal beside a whetstone. Prayers for dawn's mercy, steel sharpened just in case mercy fails to arrive. Researchers continue to argue how common these warrior priests truly were. Some claim they were outliers, exceptions born of desperate times when borders blurred and holy men felt forced to defend hearth and flock with sword in hand. Others believe the medieval church quietly accepted their double-role faith to calm the flock force to keep the wolves away. You drift to the battlefield's edge at sunrise. A priest lifts a crucifix in one hand, a battered mace in the other. He shouts a blessing words, half swallowed by the clash of armored men pushing forward into chaos. Beneath the roar, the soft rustle of Latin prayers weaves through the din, words meant to soothe souls even as bodies fell. Some peasants whispered that these armored clerics were cursed holy vows broken by bloodshed. Others saw them as protectors' saints in steel proof that faith could stand its ground when royal armies failed. So tonight, listen for the clash of metal and the quiet prayers carried on battlefield winds. Somewhere under the roar, a priest whispers absolution while his sword drips with mud, and sin proof that sometimes heaven's soldiers wore chainmail as easily as cassocks, and salvation came not just from words, but from the cold steel edge that guarded them. Gargoyles glaring from high stone ledges, spires clawing at the clouds. Tonight, you tilt your head back beneath arches that scrape the heavens' cathedrals, built not just to honor God, but to remind every king and peasant exactly who held the keys to salvation. Picture a medieval town square at dawn. Bakers' ovens puff steam into the morning chill. Market stalls creak under sacks of barley and bolts of dyed cloth. But towering above it all, casting its long shadow over every purse and prayer, stands the cathedral, a fortress of faith as solid as any castle, but more terrifying to defy. One curious fact: church leaders didn't build these stone giants out of pure piety. Each buttress and stained glass rose was propaganda in mortar, and lime-silent sermons meant to dwarf royal palaces, to anchor heaven in stone, while showing the village who truly guarded the door to paradise. Step inside the nave at dusk. The air smells of damp stone and beeswax. Candles flicker against walls carved with saints who stare down with blank eyes. A king might issue edicts from his wooden throne, but the bishop's pulpit here reaches higher, his words echoing off vaulted ribs that took decades, sometimes centuries, to complete. Surviving records reveal how kings, uneasy with the church's towering projects, sometimes tried to outdo them. Lavish palaces built just beyond cathedral shadows, hunting lodges adorned with frescoes meant to rival chapel art. Some monarchs even poured coin into cathedrals themselves, hoping donations would buy favor with both God and the local peasants, who gawked at spires and whispered prayers under their breath. A quirky detail: some cathedral builders tucked tiny carvings into hidden corners, grimacing faces, dancing devils, monks with bloated bellies drinking wine. They were secret jokes, invisible to worshippers below, but reminders to stonemasons that even the holiest house still belonged to mortal hands. Outside the main doors, peasants shuffled past stone portals that took more men and money to carve than they'd earn in a lifetime. Generations saw towers grow inch by inch, each arch laid by hands that might never see the final spire completed. For some, that soaring, unfinished skeleton was proof of the church's promise. For others, it was a monument to power they'd never touch. Historians still debate just how much these cathedrals swayed hearts and crowns. Some argue they were the church's greatest tool, eternal reminders that while a king might tax your purse, the church owned your soul and wasn't shy about carving it in stone. Others claim peasants saw through the grandeur, paying tithes grudgingly, while muttering that heaven might live closer to their muddy fields than beneath marble vaults. Picture a winter night, a flicker of torchlight against a rose window, icy wind rattling gargoyles high above. Inside, a lone monk sweeps the marble floor, echoing footsteps, swallowed by vast silence. Above him, stories of saints and martyrs dance in colored glass, bright pinpricks when dawn breaks. So tonight, drift beneath these stone vaults, where kingdoms bent in prayer as easily as in fear. Let the cold air whisper how every soaring arch and chiseled gargoyle once told the same message. Heaven is high, but the church's reach might be higher, stone roots clutching the earth, while royal crowns glittered far below. Locked wooden doors, dusty scrolls bound in twine. Tonight, you tiptoe into musty libraries, where the church decided which words would breathe and which would vanish behind chained shelves and whispered threats. Picture a quiet monastery scriptorium at dawn. Sunlight spills through narrow windows, catching the flick of quills across parchment. Monks hunch over oak desks, copying sermons line by line, but tucked in a shadowed corner, another shelf hides behind an iron grate, its contents known only to the abbot and a trusted few. One curious fact: medieval libraries didn't just store knowledge, they controlled it. Canon law gave bishops the right to ban books deemed dangerous to souls or to Rome's hold on truth. A scroll on astronomy here, a treatise on heretical visions there, each sealed away if it asked the wrong questions. You drift past rows of chained tomes, iron links clinking softly as pages flutter. A novice monk eyes you warily. He knows some texts should never be touched. Scripts copied in secret by wandering scholars, arguments about free will kingship, or saints who defied papal orders. Some volumes survived only because curious scribes hid them under dull sermons like forbidden herbs wrapped in plain brown paper. A quirky detail: in some monasteries, banned manuscripts were locked inside a libri negri, the black book chest. Its iron key hung around the abbot's neck, passed on at death to the next keeper of whispered danger. Sometimes pages were burned. Instead, the ashes scattered in abbey gardens, mulched under new vines, as if the heretical words might bloom again. Historians still puzzle over what was truly lost. Letters hint at entire treatises smuggled across borders, monks bribed with coins, or relic scraps to slip copies to noble patrons curious about banned ideas. One dusty record tells of a king who secretly funded scribes to replicate forbidden scrolls for his private study, testing whether the Vatican's fear matched the power of ink and vellum. Step into a cathedral archive at dusk. Behind a carved oak door, a bishop pores over a letter from Rome, orders to purge certain pages to root out a monk rumored to teach strange doctrines. Outside, the village knows nothing. They see only candles flickering at evening mass, the priest's steady voice blessing fields that hide no books, only wheat. Yet here and there rumors stir. A local lord's daughter, caught reading a scroll about ancient medicine, exiled to a convent before word spread. A wandering friar mumbling about forgotten gospels quietly vanished on a lonely road. No bloodied gallows or dramatic trials, just silence and the soft snap of pages locked tight. Researchers continue to debate whether the church's hidden libraries were vaults of spiritual safety or cages for ideas that might have flowered centuries earlier. Some argue the monks were guardians against chaos. Others say they stifled voices that could have rewritten Europe's story in ink instead of steel. So tonight, stand at the edge of these shadowed shelves. Feel the hush that lingers between vellum and chain, the questions half erased by cautious scribes. Somewhere beyond the iron locks, a flicker of candlelight dances over a page no bishop ever read aloud, words waiting restless, patient as dust settling on stone floors. Curtains drawn tight. footsteps down a dark corridor. Tonight, you stand outside bedchambers where holy vows met flesh and secrecy, where clerical celibacy bent under the weight of whispered promises and hidden heirs. Picture a small manor house on the edge of a cathedral town. By day, the bishop sits robed in velvet and gold, hand raised in blessing. By night, a carriage rattles to a discreet back door. A woman steps out, veil-drawn face turned away from servants who pretend not to see. She carries no title, but wields quiet power over secrets no relic or relic bearer can wash away. One curious fact: despite vows of chastity, many medieval clerics kept mistresses. Some had entire households tucked behind monastery walls, funded by tithes gathered from peasants who never guessed how their coins paid for lace bed linens and whispered lullabies to children who would never bear their father's name. Step closer to a flickering candle behind shuttered windows. Inside, a priest loosens his collar, murmurs prayers he half believes will pardon tonight's sin. The woman beside him laughs softly, pulling him back to bed. Some scholars claim the church turned a blind eye better to have a discreet mistress than a scandal in the open. A quirky detail flickers in cathedral records: lists of stipends and special household expenses paid out of diocesan funds. One bishop's ledger noted milk for the child, a polite line masking a secret heir fed on church silver. Some illegitimate sons were quietly educated, slipped into cushy abbey posts when they came of age. A clever way to keep loyalty and silence stitched together. Outside these soft chambers, the village gossips in hushed voices. Everyone knows, but no one speaks too loudly. The same priest who thunders against carnal sin on Sunday might stroll the orchard on Monday, plucking apples for a mistress hidden in a tenant's cottage. Her child's hair, suspiciously like the abbot's eyes, the same gray as the man who blesses their grain. Historians still argue how widespread these bedchambers were. Some say they were the exception bad apples in an orchard mostly pure. Others dig through old excommunication records and find a trail of quiet payments bribed scribes and papal pardons issued when scandal threatened to leak too far. Slip now into a cold stone hallway where an old nun kneels in prayer. She knows the truth. Perhaps she once carried a secret herself. Maybe she too traded vows for warmth when winter drafts rattled the cloisters. Some secrets rotted behind convent walls, traded for hush money or confession. Behind closed doors, a priest might promise his mistress a fine dowry for her silence or land for the child to inherit through a cousin's name. Some of these illegitimate heirs rose high, wealthy, educated, sometimes powerful enough to keep the circle spinning, an open secret tucked under velvet vestments. Researchers still debate whether these bedchambers eroded the church's power or cemented it. Did whispered scandals weaken the altar's hold, or did they prove how deeply the church could bury its own sins beneath layers of ritual and relics? So tonight, pause outside that quiet door. Listen for laughter, a hush of breath, the creak of a bed meant for prayers, but used instead for mortal warmth. And wonder, when dawn breaks, will the priest kneel in his chapel and whisper forgiveness for a sin he never truly meant to quit bare feet on rough gravel, a crown traded for a pilgrim's cloak. Tonight, you walk beside exiled kings and rebellious nobles who learned that defying Rome could send them trudging dusty roads toward shrines they might never reach. Picture a gray dawn on a muddy trail winding through tangled forests. A royal figure once draped in ermine and gold now pulls a coarse wool cloak tighter against the chill. No retinue of silk-clad courtiers here, just a handful of grim-faced knights and a priest whose job is not to protect, but to watch. Every mile walked is penance for a sin too great to confess at court. One curious fact: the church's power to exile wasn't always about throwing someone out of the kingdom. It was about casting them out of heaven's good graces unless they proved themselves humble enough to earn the door back open. A crown might shield a king from blades, but not from the slow erosion of penance, one blistered footstep at a time. Step with this wayward monarch toward a holy shrine perched high on a windswept hill. Maybe it's Santiago de Compostela, or Canterbury, or Rome itself. Some went alone to prove repentance. Others paraded their shame under the eyes of cheering or jeering crowds. Along the way, they slept in haylofts, begged crusts from peasants, and hoped each candle lit at a relic's foot would soften Rome's judgment. A quirky detail: some exiled royals padded their penances with luxury. Chronicles tell of kings who brought chefs and minstrels on pilgrimages, setting up velvet tents beside holy wells, the scent of roasting boar wafting over the same peasants who scraped copper coins together for the same blessings. Yet not all journeys were gilded. Some exiles vanished on the road, robbed by brigands, struck down by fever, or murdered by enemies, who knew a king stripped of Rome's protection was easy prey. Historians still argue whether some penances were honest acts of humility or convenient ways to get troublesome rulers out of the way until the church's coffers filled back up. You drift beside an ancient shrine where an exiled duke kneels in the damp, pressing cracked lips to the marble tomb of a saint. He mumbles prayers, but his mind is on the castle he left behind the throne now claimed by a cousin or rival. He leaves coins and a jewel or two, hoping the monks whisper well of him when Rome asks for word of his soul. Sometimes the punishment worked: absolution, granted the crown, restored a lesson learned. Other times, the penitent king returned harder, his gratitude thin as the sandals he wore out on the road. A few rose in rebellion again. Swords drawn, papal threats be damned. Researchers continue to piece together letters from abbots and bishops who watch these royal pilgrims shuffle through their gates. Each dusty footprint a testament to how Rome's reach stretched past armies and walls slipping through cold night winds to settle on a king's bare feet. So tonight, picture that lonely road. Lantern light flickers as the penitent monarch trudges forward, crown left behind for a rough walking stick. Behind him, a line of prayers, some whispered in faith, others in secret relief, that the throne sits empty long enough for new hands to test its weight. Boiling water, hissing in an iron pot. A trembling hand reaching for a red-hot bar. Tonight, you stand at the edge of a smoky hall where kings and commoners alike proved innocence not with evidence, but with burned flesh and blind faith in divine judgment. Picture a torchlit chamber deep inside a castle keep. Stone walls drip with damp. Nobles cluster in shadows, while priests chant Latin verses that echo off beams blackened by decades of trial fires. In the center, a brazier glows. Over it, water bubbles, scalding pure waiting to test a monarch's loyal knight, or a rebellious vassal who swears he didn't betray his king. One curious fact: trial by ordeal wasn't some peasant superstition. It was law across medieval Europe, with priests presiding like judges, their blessings, giving divine weight to each blistered hand or seared arm. The belief God would guard the innocent skin, heal it quickly, or leave the guilty wound to fester as proof. Step closer to the brazier. The accused kneels eyes wide beneath the weight of nobles watching from carved benches. He plunges his hand into the boiling pot, searching for a stone at the bottom, proof he trusts heaven's judgment more than earthly swords. Or maybe it's the ordeal of the red-hot iron three-measured steps across the rush-covered floor bar, gripped tight silent prayers clashing with the hiss of burned flesh. A quirky detail often overlooked: the church issued precise instructions for these trials. The iron's weight, the water's depth, how the bandages must be tied after the burn, then unwrapped days later for priests to inspect. If the wound looked clean, innocence; if infected, guilt and often ruin. Outside this grim chamber, kings used ordeal to settle disputes they couldn't judge by words alone. Was a noble's oath true or twisted by ambition? Did a knight truly remain loyal when rumors swirled of secret letters to Rome? When ink and confession failed fire and water spoke instead? Some historians argue that ordeal was a crude test of faith and endurance. Others claim it was theater and intimidating ritual that reminded every baron and serf that heaven's verdict mattered more than mortal witnesses. And sometimes, just sometimes, the test was rigged. A priest might dip a hand in holy oil before the iron-touched skin, a discreet blessing for a favored knight whose innocence the king already wished to prove. Step now into the courtyard outside. Peasants gather breath, rising in clouds, as they wait to see if the accused emerges wrapped in clean cloth or chains. Mothers clutch children tighter, reminding them that sin and salvation can both hide in calloused palms and blistered wrists. Surviving chronicles speak of kings watching these trials with blank faces. Some claimed they wept for the pain their subjects endured. Others drank wine in side chambers, confident the trial's outcome would bend to politics more easily than the iron bent in the brazier's flame. Researchers still debate whether ordeal truly deterred treason or simply punished the unlucky and the powerless. Did it test faith, or did it break it one scalded hand at a time? So tonight, feel the heat of the iron bar, the hiss of water gone still. Listen for the whispered prayers that hovered over blistered skin, and wonder how many crowns stayed steady on royal brows, because a trembling knight's wounds healed just enough to satisfy heaven's cold, searing judgment. A royal bedchamber stripped bare, a quill scratching across parchment thick with royal seals. Tonight, you stand at the candlelit cradle of the Tudor breakaway, where a king's thirst for freedom from Rome split crowns and crosses forever. Picture Henry VIII pacing his palace halls in London, a crown too heavy on his brow, his marriage bed cold where an heir should lie. Outside his chamber, bishops mutter prayers for a son. Inside, Henry's eyes drift from the crucifix on the wall to the blank space beside him, where a new wife might stand if only the Pope would whisper yes. One curious fact: kings before Henry had defied the church in secret, but few dared make their rebellion the law of the realm. Henry demanded more than annulment he wanted. Rome's iron grip wrenched off every English parish, every gilded altar. And when the Pope refused, Henry's scribes inked the act of supremacy, crowning him not just king, but supreme head of the Church of England. Step into a smoky council chamber where nobles lean over wax-dripped scrolls. Some tremble at the thought. Others grin at the gold to be seized from abbeys and shrines. Overnight, holy relics that drew pilgrims by the thousands were plucked from altars, locked away, or melted down to fill royal coffers hungry for new palaces and more cannons. A quirky detail rumors swirled that some of Henry's men disguised their looting as relic inspections. Monks found themselves cornered by royal inspectors, wielding lists of fake bones and dubious saints, an easy excuse to strip sanctuaries bare and ship the treasures to London in creaking carts. Historians still debate How much of Henry's break was holy principle, and how much was raw desire, his longing for Anne Boleyn's arms, for a line of sons to secure the Tudor crown, for power unchecked by Latin prayers drifting from Rome's faraway halls. Outside the royal court, ordinary people stumbled into this new world half awake. Some grumbled as stained glass windows vanished from parish churches, saints' statues smashed on cold flagstones. Others gladly traded papal taxes for an English Bible read aloud by local priests who no longer feared Rome's threat of excommunication. Step into a shuttered abbey at dusk. Monks shuffle out robes, clutch tight as royal men-at-arms inventory every silver chalice and embroidered cope. A fat goose roasts over the old monastery hearth, now claimed for the king's household. Some brothers vanish into other monasteries abroad. Others quietly marry their vows of celibacy, lost in the king's new order. A quirky note from a courtier's diary tells of villagers sneaking old relics into hidden cupboards, praying secretly to bones and scraps the king's inspectors never found. For them, faith lingered behind locked doors long after Henry's iron seal broke with Rome. Researchers continue to argue whether the Tudor breakaway freed England's crown or simply crowned it with a new cage, one where the king's word replaced the pope's, but the tithes and taxes stayed much the same. Did it crack the old holy order wide open, or just paint it with the Tudor rose? So tonight, drift through palace corridors, where Henry's shadow still looms. Hear the faint scrape of parchment that split kingdoms from Rome's grasp, the soft prayers of monks packing relics into secret chests, and wonder how many crowns since have worn that double weight, king and pope, temporal and eternal, divided forever by one king's hunger for freedom, and a son to bear his name. An ink-stained pamphlet slipped under a tavern door, candlelit debates behind closed shutters. Tonight you drift through flickering salons and cluttered desks where Enlightenment thinkers loosened the last knots binding royal crowns to Rome's ancient keys. Picture a cramped study in 18th century Paris. The air thick with pipe smoke and whispered arguments. A philosopher leans over a battered table quill, scratching furiously at a manuscript destined to slip past censors and land in curious hands. Outside, the cathedral bells still toll vespers, but inside, the talk is of reason, natural rights, and kings, who no longer need a bishop's blessing to sit secure on gilded thrones. One curious fact: for centuries, monarchs owed not just crowns, but legitimacy itself to papal anointing holy oil that declared their rule heaven's will. But as Enlightenment ideas took root, scholars and pamphleteers asked a dangerous question: if a king rules by the consent of the governed, what need has he of Rome's nod? Step into a London coffeehouse buzzing with restless chatter. Merchants argue over trade tariffs, while radical pamphlets circulate from table to table. A young barrister reads aloud from Locke or Voltaire, voice low, but words sharp enough to slice through 1,000 years of canon law. A nobleman leans closer, wondering if his loyalty to Rome might soon cost him more than it saves. Outside these smoky rooms, bishops still crown kings in stained glass chapels. Yet inside parchment-lined cabinets, royal councils plot to tax church lands, break monastic monopolies, and bring once untouchable clerics under crown courts. Surviving letters from wary priests show a scramble to adapt, some bowing to royal authority, others clinging to Rome's distant promise that a papal bull could still silence a rebellious king. A quirky detail: in some cities, banned Enlightenment tracts were smuggled in hollowed-out Bibles, inked pages about divine right, giving way halfway through to essays on reason and liberty. a paper rebellion pressed between psalms. Scholars still debate how complete this loosening truly was. In Catholic strongholds, bishops fought back excommunicating freethinkers and warning kings of damnation if they dared seize abbey fields or meddle with holy tithes. But bit by bit, the crowns that once trembled before the Pope's seal now weighed their own people's will more heavily than Rome's blessing. Drift into an Austrian court where Joseph II trims church privileges with the cool snip of a reformer's decree. In Spain, priests quietly swear loyalty to the king before the Pope. In Prussia, a Protestant monarch shrugs off Rome entirely. His crown needs no anointing oil when steel and trade keep it polished. Meanwhile, in dusty libraries, old coronation manuals sit unopened. Monarchs still wear ermine and jewels, but the true coronation happens on parchment constitutions inked by scholars who declared that sovereignty came from men's consent, not a bishop's whispered Latin. Some peasants cheer this new dawn. Some kneel before relics anyway, just in case the philosophers are wrong, and heaven still minds who wears the crown. Historians still argue whether the Enlightenment ended Rome's grip outright, or merely taught monarchs a new dance, bowing to the people's will, with one eye on eternity, hedging bets with both reason and rosary. So tonight, drift through those candlelit salons, where reason hummed like a spark among dry parchment. Listen for the rustle of banned pages turned by flickering lamplight, and wonder if the last drops of holy oil ever fully dried from the crowns, now resting on mortal brows alone. A modern city hums with neon lights and quiet cathedrals. Tonight, you stand at the edge of centuries, listening for echoes of ancient power that still linger in marble steps and whispered blessings over presidential oaths. Picture a glass parliament chamber in a bustling European capital. Lawmakers scroll through tablets instead of parchment, debate budgets instead of relics. Yet outside the chamber's sleek doors, a bishop's office still waits nearby, ready to weigh in when secular power drifts too far from centuries-old dogma. Some laugh that faith has no teeth left. Others know it only hides them behind softer smiles. One curious fact in some modern nations: church and state stand as polite neighbors, technically divided, practically entangled. Tax exemptions for churches, state-funded chaplains in armies, bishops seated at national ceremonies as a silent reminder that once upon a time a crown sat lighter when blessed by Rome. Step into a courtroom in the present day. A judge's gavel replaces the priest's scepter, but the witness still swears an oath on Holy Scripture, words echoing the ancient belief that divine truth binds mortal lies. In presidential inaugurations, from Washington to Warsaw, hands rest on Bibles. Blessings are invoked, proof that the church's fingerprints linger on rituals dressed up in modern suits. A quirky detail in some European parliaments: bishops still sit on advisory councils or hold ceremonial votes. A relic of older times, or a quiet guardrail for kings and presidents who know that a nod from the pulpit can still sway a rural village more than a campaign poster ever could. Outside in suburban neighborhoods, church bells still chime through Sunday mornings. Couples whisper vows under stained glass babies, splash in baptismal fonts once reserved for the children of knights and queens. A crown might be gone, but the church's soft power winds through weddings, funerals, local charities, tiny reminders that salvation and community still share an altar. Historians argue about how deep these roots run. Some insist the modern state is purely secular, now its thrones long unchained from Rome's keys. Others point to debates over abortion laws, faith-based schools, chaplains in prisons, threads of medieval power woven into new tapestries of votes and legislation. Drift into a city cathedral at dusk. Tourists snap photos under Gothic arches built by peasants who once handed over tithes with trembling hands. Now, their descendants drop spare coins in donation boxes, unaware they stand on stone floors, funded by taxes once bled from kings at Rome's demand. A single papal statement might still tilt a politician's poll numbers. A bishop's blessing might still close or open doors behind high marble walls. Not with the iron weight of excommunication or burning relics, but with soft words that ripple through pulpits and press conferences alike. So tonight, pause beneath a cathedral's soaring nave. Feel the hush that lingers between stained glass and smartphone glow. For all our talk of secular crowns and reason's reign, the echo of old power hums through the silence, reminding kings, presidents, and even sleepy cities that the church's shadow, though thinner, still drifts across the throne. So now, dear listener, let your eyes grow heavy as the echoes of crowns and crosses fade into a softer hush. Picture those old cathedrals swallowed by ivy, the gold leaf of ancient Bibles curling gently with age. The bells toll somewhere far away, but here, in this quiet corner, you hold only your breath and the warmth of your blanket. If you wish, imagine walking barefoot down candlelit aisles, each step softer than the last. Stone pillars rise around you, but they cannot bind you. The whispers of kings and bishops drift away like incense smoke in a midnight breeze. Let them go. Let them dissolve into the hush of dreams. Tomorrow's world hums with bright screens and busy roads, but for now, you drift back to fields where peasants once knelt, to castles where secrets faded into stone walls. All that remains is a hush, a promise that sleep comes for everyone, king, monk, wanderer alike. If you find a thought lingering, tuck it beneath your pillow. If you feel a question stirring, let it rest here tonight. History's weight will wait until dawn. For now, breathe easy. You are safe wrapped in stories that slip away like candle flames snuffed by gentle winds.